Netherborne, the Ancient Devourer. Chapter 76. God Complex. Ugh, my head. Alice groaned as she sat up and massaged her temples. What the hell happened? Victor blinked his many golden eyes in confusion. Alice was almost semi-translucent. Was that what happened when a mana body was mana deficient? Similar to how humans went deathly pale due to blood loss? He could only wonder as he floated right beside her. Seeing Alice was alive and well, Victor was relieved. Welcome back to the land of the living, he joked before becoming more serious. Maybe don't use that void form again. Alice rolled her eyes. Yeah, no shit, genius. I thought I was a goner. That was beyond terrifying. Not to mention painful. Then, with a huff, she stood up, and while stretching her back, she looked around the vast grassy meadow of the first floor of the grand dungeon with her hands on her hips. Where is the Hiveth bitch head? Had Alice always been this bold? Where had the little slave girl that was barely skin and bones gone? Victor sighed and answered his companion. Hiveth left to check on my town to verify my words that I was managing a town of humans without killing them all. Alice nodded. I see. I need to see that town again sometime. I wonder how everyone's doing. Victor closed his many eyes and monitored the situation on the surface through Andrew. It seemed Hiveth was having a hard time wrapping her head around the residents of Necron. Victor had naturally not wanted to turn his residents into zombies. Otherwise, the stench of undead in Necron and the horrifying appearances of its residents would scare off any potential visitors. So he had created a new race of undead. Unlike with the slave traders, he wasn't making chimeras out of the citizens, so he had no need to go find a monster to merge people with to create the preserved corpse race. The idea was simple: have a race of undead be as similar to living humans as possible while retaining the benefits of being undead, such as immortality. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best he could do. All he had to do was imagine the race's desired characteristics, and his spell did the rest. However, Victor was suspicious that being linked to the World Core had upgraded his powers because he swore he couldn't create new races so easily before. Suddenly Hiveth vanished, and Victor lost sight of her. Well, Necron is still standing. That's a positive, at least. Is she heading back here? There was a pop as space warped, and Hiveth stepped out of a portal with an expression of few met. From Victor. We need to talk. Victor nodded and gave Hiveth the floor. I'm all ears. Well, not that I have them, but you get the point. Hiveth crossed her arms and sighed. Your words, however ridiculous they may sound, add up. Somewhat. I have never seen this axon you speak of, nor these rifts. However, you do seem to manage a town of the undead rather well, but it's simply not enough to trust you a void creature with the future of this planet. That was fair. Victor hadn't really considered her side of things. Without even mentioning the fact he had made an enemy of the dragons by slaughtering their unborn children, he was a void creature that claimed to want to switch sides. It was hard to believe, even for him. But we need to get the situation under control. I can feel the unrest in the world. I know what a demon lord's arrival entails. There will soon be a war which I care little for, but it could lead to outside invaders interfering. So here is my proposal: leave the dragons out of your conflict. That was not what Victor anticipated at all. Why? I will be frank. A relationship between us dragons and you is simply impossible, even ignoring your slaughtering of our kind. We won't bend to a new ruler, except the weakest. Hiveth scowled at Zamaris, who was still respectfully on the floor. She looked back at Victor, and her inhuman eyes stared into his. So just give up on that front. In fact, I can guarantee my kind won't even be willing to work alongside you. They have not seen the things I have in the distant worlds, and no amount of convincing will change their ways. So what do you propose? Victor was confused. Hiveth had yet to provide a solution to their conflict. The dragons, dead or alive, would immensely help his war efforts, and he wanted them gone from the surface as they were a threat to his operations. Hiveth smiled. I offer my help, and in return, you will leave the dragons out of this. That was tempting. The fight with Hiveth had shown Victor's flaws. He lacked teleportation and movement spells to catch up to fast opponents, and his assassination techniques were pointless if his opponents reacted too fast or he couldn't pierce their defenses. Also, he was running out of time. Dealing with the dragons could take days' time he didn't have the luxury of wasting. Maybe the dragons would come under his rule later once he had a better grasp on his new powers and current situation. It wasn't ideal, but Hiveth's offer wasn't bad. There was only one minor issue. How can I trust you? Hiveth seemed taken aback, as if what Victor had said was the most ridiculous thing she had ever heard. Dragons have such great pride for a reason. We would rather die than go back on our word and be tarnished as a liar. Victor didn't like that answer at all. Trust was such a fickle thing. The last thing he needed was Hiveth as an enemy. But considering he planned to backstab her at some point, he just needed to keep his wits about him. I need to reduce my weak links, he thought as he brought up his claw. I will leave the dragons out of my conflict in exchange for your assistance. Deal. Hyveth stared at the claw. What are you doing? Victor tilted his head. A handshake. A human gesture of goodwill and agreement. I see. Hyveth reached her hand forward, grabbed Victor's middle claw, and gently shook it. On my name, I swear to uphold my side of the deal. On the topic of reducing his weak links, Victor had an idea. Leaving Hyveth to wait for a moment, he returned to the lowest control room in the Grand Dungeon with Alice, where he found Genus and explained the situation. Genus was clearly unhappy that the Arkwings remained in control, but Victor reached a compromise. Genus, I believe you are a very competent ruler, but as a dragon, you are weak. You should know better than anyone that dragons only respect the strong. The golden dragon slumped to the floor and groaned. He had just had to turn tail and run from Hyveth, yet he had expected to rule over the dragons? Without constant supervision from Victor, he would be killed for his arrogance. I plan to ask Hyveth to teleport my town down here onto an island. Would you like a neighboring island just for you where the mana will be very dense with various biomes? You can also practice ruling over the town when I'm not around. Victor knew Andrew was doing a good job at managing Necron in its current state, but the town might expand in the future, so having Genus integrate into the town prematurely would be ideal. That seemed to arouse the dragon's interest. The Grand Dungeon was dense in mana and could grow at 10 times the speed of his brethren on the surface. So long as the humans don't bother me too much, I could settle with that. For now. His eyes glinted with restrained fury. But when I am strong enough, the Arkwings will pay. Victor didn't mind and just agreed with Genus's words. The dragons were now a problem for later. He wanted to get his town safe before he went to all-out war with the surrounding kingdoms. The last thing he needed was another Empire raid incident, and what better solution than hiding his town down in the depths of his own dungeon. There was just a slight issue: mana toxicity. If Victor brought the residents down here to the Grand Dungeon's depths, the undead would likely survive, but the living would perish instantly. Luckily, he could use the computer to add another skill to the cards he had made last time, as there was a handy upgrade artifact feature. So, 10 minutes later, he had added mana resistance to all the cards, and now all he needed to do was make the island. Switching back to the world core's point of view, he saw the thousands of floating islands in the last floor's pocket dimension, but none were large enough or had the biome he wanted for his utopia. Deciding to merge around 100 islands, the void trembled as the mana bridges that connected them shattered, and the islands began to float toward a central point. A while later, a landmass the size of a continent was created. Victor then spent some mana to make a sizable habitable area with a flat meadow, streams of crystal clear water, and pleasant wildlife. There was also plenty of farmland, far from the island's edge, so the residents wouldn't be terrified of the looming void. Another large island was brought along for Genus, and Victor maneuvered it to be above the continent-sized island. Below Genus's island was a volcanic region that was a fair distance away from the area the town would be, but close enough that Genus could fly there in a few minutes. This was all done to reduce the number of interruptions to the dragon's sleep. Satisfied with his handiwork and trying to suppress his god complex that had sprouted up as he moved and merged islands, Victor decided he needed to give the continent he had just created a name before Hyveth teleported Necron. Victor mulled over his options for a moment, but no matter how he tried, a single word seemed to encapsulate the utopia he was trying to achieve. He may not be a religious man, but he sure felt like a living god. Henceforth, this land shall be known as Eden. And it will be my utopia in this dying world. Chapter 77. A quick recap. Start of Book 2. Vox, Victor's human-sized avatar formed from shadow magic, sat upon a summoned throne of shadows. It was easier to communicate with the humans like this, as he had no desire to incite fear among his own people. They were already loyal enough, as demonstrated by eagerly lining up to receive card-shaped slabs of emeralds. Hyveth Arkspace, one of the few ancient dragons and his latest ally, stood by his side, watching the proceeds with her inhuman crystal eyes. The single golden horn jutting from her head glistened in the midday sun that shone through the windows. Victor would be happy to have such a person stand by his side, if not for her constant tapping. Her clawed human fingers drummed on her scaled arm in an accelerating rhythmic beat, showing her growing impatience. Hyveth had offered her assistance in his world domination plans on the basis he left the dragons out of the conflict, which he had honored so far. Deciding to avoid the dragon's lair altogether, they teleported to the first floor of the Grand Dungeon and then took the tunnel Wiggles made to get to Necron. Vox, care to explain this to me? Hyveth hissed through her teeth as she watched a middle-aged man graciously receive an emerald card from Andrew the King Ooze, a 10-meter-long gray slime and mayor of Necron. The man poked his finger on a knife tip and imprinted his bloody fingerprint upon the surface of the emerald. It flashed a brilliant green and vanished. Seconds later, the man opened his eyes. His pupils had transitioned from a usual brown to a liquid emerald, and his skin glowed with a green hue. The man looked at his glowing skin with curiosity and gasped as the emerald card rematerialized in his hand. And he was not the only one. A group of excited humans huddled in the corner of the room, all exclaiming about their changed eye color. Some were mortals, and others were preserved corpses under his black ocean's control. What exactly do you wish for me to explain? Vox replied, resting his shadowy head on his palm. Of course, both the throne and avatar were made of nothing but shadows and therefore weightless, so he had no need to assume this tired posture, but he wanted to convey his displeasure with Hyveth's comments, and her fidgeting was also doing her no favors. Hyveth frowned at Vox. Are we not in a partnership? How can I assist with your plans if I don't know what's happening? You said we are on a time crunch and that the other world cores close in on the cursed forest with every passing second, yet you sit here giving things to humans for free. Vox raised his hand to silence her. Fine. Disclosing some details is only fair. Those emerald cards have many inbuilt abilities that derive their power from my demon core, one of which is passive mana resistance. A skill these fleshy mortals will need to survive in my dungeon depths, as the mana is far too dense for an ordinary human to survive. Vox looked into Hyveth's inhumane crystal eyes. As for a time crunch? That is true, but you forget something, my dragon friend. And that is? Hyveth scowled, clearly hating that she was the clueless one in this exchange and Vox's casual tone while addressing someone of her stature and power. This is just one of my 3 bodies. While I sit here showing my presence to reassure my citizens, my Netherborne body is busy reviving my collection of ice statues of few buildings from here to form an army for Toby to defend against the Empire. Vox sighed. Meanwhile, my demon core is mass-producing undead on the upper floors to defend the south and western flanks. Vox's teardrop eyes dulled as his vision rapidly switched between his bodies. His shadowy avatar was nothing but a glorified projection that he could cast spells through at a high cost. Nevertheless, his Netherborne body remained his greatest asset for combat scenarios and casting spells. Toby, the one-eyed demon king, was practically jumping with joy as Victor hovered over the ice statues casting rays undead over and over. Mana was almost free when your mana pool was the size of a continent, even if it was rapidly shrinking. The sound of ice shattering and the roars of many ANS-grade monsters reawakening from a long slumber filled the cursed forest. The black ocean looked like a sea of bright lights as many powerful creatures joined the ranks, and most fearsome of all, they absorbed all the latent knowledge in the network. Victor smiled. As they say, knowledge is power, and he needed all the strength he could muster to defend against the entire world by himself. Rather than mindless beasts fueled by their hunger, they were now aware of war formations, how to farm, construction, and even human language. This was the true might of the Black Ocean and Victor's main motivation for wanting to keep Necron safe. With so many undead humans joining the Black Ocean network with various skills in different fields, the hive mind became stronger as knowledge was shared as an instinct. The Empire Knights turned Death Knights had contributed essential information about how wars were fought. It became instinctual knowledge to all the undead under Victor's control. Looking down at the horde of monsters, Victor turned to look at Alice, who was floating beside him. Her liquid gold eyes scanned the ground with curiosity and a light smile on her lips. You seem happy? Victor's ancient voice didn't even seem to faze the girl as her smile grew wider. She chose not to wear clothes and instead had a dense black mana shield coating her skin like armor at all times. It flickered and flowed as if alive, and her face was exposed. She turned to face Victor. Happy? I am more than happy. Exhilarated would be a better term. Finally, no more running and hiding. A savage grin appeared on her crazed face. I know. We have more power at our disposal than anyone else. Victor shook his head, his many golden eyes tracing the horizon. Silly girl, we may match the strength of a single kingdom, or perhaps even the Empire, but we face the world. Alice clenched her mana-coated fist. Then so be it. We can conquer them one at a time. Conquer suggests subjugation of fate. I plan for the other world cores, but not for this planet's people. Endless slaughter will only doom this world faster. Will those rifts really come? Alice asked. A hint of skepticism in her tone. There are no absolutes in life, but Axon is a far greater threat to me than this world's inhabitants, that's for sure. Victor pointed a claw to his shadowy face. If Axon could control my mind, then they can do it again. The last thing I want is for Axon to get a foothold on this planet and take advantage of the worldwide war caused by the Demon Lord quest. Alice's golden gaze drifted to the red beacon that marked the entrance to the Cursed Forest's grand dungeon in the north. A worldwide hunt for a Demon Lord. What a joke. What makes it a joke? Victor wondered. They will be blinded by the rewards and refuse to accept their own greed will lead to their demise. Alice sighed. Human greed always triumphs over logic. No matter what we say, they will just aim for those silly contribution points provided by the other world cores. Exactly, human greed will be our greatest weapon in this war. Who said only the world core could offer rewards? I just need to provide the sweeter deal to make them switch to the dark side. Victor chuckled and summoned his royal card that floated above his hand. What are some arbitrary contribution points in the face of eternal life, endless food, and a monodense utopia? Alice sighed, but is it really worth it? To go through all this hassle when we could storm each kingdom and annihilate them with overwhelming might? Surely the people would bend the knee in subservience to you if you wished it. The golden card vanished back into Victor's soul. Worth it? Absolutely. With my Black Ocean network and a utopia to nurture them, the human race will advance at unprecedented speeds, and with my careful management, Axon will never step foot on this world. I would prefer to wipe all these vermin out, Ashnar especially. But if luring them in with superior rewards is your aim, then I suggest we start with the Frostlands. Victor tilted his head. Oh, the Frostlands? That mining nation located north of the Grand Dungeon. MHM. Alice nodded, her black hair briefly obscuring her golden eyes. They are already struggling from famine, and the arrival of a demon lord on their doorstep has likely crippled their economy. As the most desperate, they would be a good first target. Victor thought for a moment. Her line of logic did make sense, and securing another world core so early on would make it 2 demon cores against 3 world cores. The Frostlands was also close by and in an easy-to-defend location, considering mountains surrounded it on all sides. But there was also the risk of letting the Empire and Ashnar organize their forces and attack while he was busy up north. How slow are the Empire and Ashnar at making decisions? Victor was used to living in a world with the internet and departments dedicated to disaster response. In such a connected world, global leaders could make decisions within a day. Alice snorted. Hilariously slow. Especially the Empire, which is notorious for having crappy nobles. Those bastards are more concerned about making each other lose more knights than actually suppressing any rebellions or dealing with monsters. That reassured Victor that invading the Frostlands quickly was the best move. Although the Demon Lord's quest and contribution counter made him fear the nobles would disregard all rationality due to fear of missing out on the juicy rewards. The other world cores have designated you as a world-ending threat. As a result, your system access is restricted, and the world's denizens will gain rewards for your destruction. Your allies have also been marked as hostile. Victor concluded that the most important thing to do now was to remove his weakest link. Necron was like the command center for his hive mind and would serve as a propaganda engine to convince the rest of the world that life under his leadership was better than slaughtering his allies for contribution points. All he needed was control over all the world cores. Only then was he sure he could find a way to stop all this Demon Lord nonsense. Surrounded by an army of monsters, Toby stood below, looking up at his overlord. With all of them revived and not a single ice statue remaining, Victor was confident he had an army that could hold off the Empire until he got back from the Frostlands. Toby, my champion, heed my words. Victor's ancient voice made the one-eyed Demon King straighten up. Your mission is to guard the cursed forest's border with the Empire. Make sure to hold a strategic line and leave no gaps. You must stop the encroaching world core's mana from eating away at my land. Victor decided to ignore the fact Toby was practically vibrating from excitement. He knew the man was a battle junkie, but this was excessive. Oh, and one more thing. Do not engage or invade the Empire. Just hold the line. Toby's face darkened, but Victor added, however, I give permission to kill anyone who tries to cross the border. Thank you, Master. Toby's voice thundered, and all the monsters roared behind him in unison. Now go. Victor pointed to the distance with his claw. Defend my land in my name. Victor watched the horde of monsters that could flatten a city charge to the east. Now then. Victor returned his sights to Necron. It was time to prepare for the teleportation of his city into the dungeon's depths. Chapter 78. Arrival in Eden. Time was of the essence. Victor watched Toby charging off to the east to defend against the Empire World Core, which left 3 cardinal directions undefended. All with world cores, armies, and delvers likely anxious to invade and slaughter Necron's citizens and his own army for those sweet contribution points. Victor planned to send a basic undead army manufactured on the top floors of his grand dungeon for the south and west borders. Switching his view to his demon core, Victor could see everything occurring in his dungeon. On the top floor, around the ivory tower that had bore witness to the slaughtering of unborn dragons, a dense cloud of mana blanketed the land and swirled around. He could command this mana to form undead from thin air, but that would be horrifically mana inefficient. Instead, using the thousands of corpses buried under the lush meadow was far more cost-effective. How they had got there, Victor had no idea, but some kind of great war had undoubtedly occurred in the distant past. Under his direction, the mana sunk into the ground, causing it to tremble. The soil cracked as white fingers poked through, promptly followed by entire limbs and torsos. Thousands of humans climbed from their graves, and so did hundreds of dog-sized dragons. He wasn't sure whether these dragons were the ones he killed or simply random baby dragons that died long ago. His functions as a dungeon core and his Netherborne's affinity for the undead combined in a beautiful display as thousands of undead stood at attention, blue flames sprouting to life in their empty eye sockets. Black mana then coated their bones, giving them armor of shadows and empowering the weapons a few held. The Black Ocean network once again buzzed with activity as thousands of new nodes were designated. Victor randomly assigned commanders, usually those with the most equipment and, of course, the baby dragons, and very quickly, he had a functional army of the dead on his hands. It wasn't perfect. The thousands of shadow-clad skeletons looked menacing at first glance, but they lacked equipment such as swords, bows, or armor. They also had little way to deal with long-range spells. Luckily the baby dragons could fly with wings of shadows, so there was hope against aerial-based opponents. It's fine. Victor thought to himself as he made the thousands of undead form into grids with their commanders standing at the front. This army is temporary anyway and should be strong enough to hold the line for a few days. Victor held no delusions that such an army wouldn't be enough to keep Eshnar and the mystical realm at bay for more than a week, but he remained hopeful. With the army ready for Hyveth to teleport, Victor returned his vision to Necron. His shadowy body was still sitting on a throne of shadows with an irritated Hyveth standing at his side. It's time to go. Vox Victor's shadowy avatar announced, and Hyveth perked up her inhuman crystal eyes glancing his way. Can I finally teleport this place and leave? Hyveth asked. No. Vox replied, after teleporting Necron to the lowest floor of the Grand Dungeon, I need you to teleport 2 armies out to the south and west flanks of the Cursed Forest. Why? Hyveth tilted her head, can't you just march them out? The other dragons may be abiding by your request of not entering the Grand Dungeon for now. Vox said, but I doubt they would appreciate thousands of undead marching across their land on the surface, and if one particularly angry dragon decided to decimate my army after seeing it contained undead baby dragons, I would have nothing on hand to defend 2 entire flanks. Right. At first sight of undead children, the other dragons would obliterate your army. Hyveth sighed, fine. I will teleport your armies, but then I'm done. Vox shrugged his shadowy shoulders. Sure, I have no need for your services after that for a while at least. You can go and speak with the dragons some more and reach a better agreement. I am sure we can collaborate eventually. Hyveth laughed slightly, you dream far too much. It's a miracle that they agreed to not storm inside the Grand Dungeon and mess with you. That alone is good enough for now. She then glanced around the room, which was still full of humans gathered in groups and excitedly discussing the recently acquired citizenship that came with interesting effects. Is this all of them? Hyveth asked. Vox's teardrop eyes seemed to smile upwards. Oh. Worried about the pathetic fleshy humans. Vox laughed as he stood from his throne of shadows. Before Hyveth could retort, Vox addressed the people in the room. Citizens of Necron. For your own safety, I have enlisted the help of an ancient dragon to transport Necron to a new land deep in the depths of the world and safe from all threats. Murmurs of excitement filled the room, but Vox continued unperturbed. As discussed before, once Necron has arrived in its new home, nobody is required to work. Lush farmland nearby will be attended to by an undead workforce, and the dense ambient mana alone will keep you all healthy. However, Vox summoned a blue card from his storage. If you wish to climb the noble ladder of Necron, you are free to apply for jobs with Andrew. These will include more advanced skills like blacksmithing, carpentry, and swordsmanship. Hundreds of glowing green eyes from Necron's newest green card citizens all looked at the floating blue card with awe. Victor didn't care for mundane professions like farming or hunting. Food could be produced en masse with his dungeon skills, and he could create genetically modified animals that provide the maximum amount of meat when killed that cannot move or fight back. He couldn't replicate highly skilled labor, or at least not for now. Eventually, with his Black Ocean network sharing knowledge, every undead, including the undead citizens and his goblins, could somewhat replicate skilled labor. But Victor had noticed that while his Black Ocean network shared knowledge, this world worked off of classes. A person with a carpenter class would have abilities granted by a world core which cannot be replicated with simple knowledge. Didn't the system tell me that those under my control would have restricted access to the system? Is my demon core picking up the slack? Victor suddenly had an idea. If he could make his own undead species and even create artifacts that granted abilities, wasn't he just one step away from creating his own classes? He had overtaken the world core and obtained all of its functions. However, he wasn't familiar with them all yet, and his situation made sitting down and experimenting with his new powers difficult. Darn, time crunch. Why can't the other world cores just chill for a moment and give me time to think? Storing the thought of making his own classes away in the back of his mind, Vox made the blue card vanish and continued his speech. Is there anyone left that has not been given citizenship? Those green cards provide you with mana resistance, which is crucial to surviving down in the depths of the dungeon. Anyone still in Necron and without the card will die within minutes. It was like going out into space without a spacesuit, just slightly less extreme. Without mana resistance, the ambient mana of the lowest floor will feel burning hot and kill these low-level humans. The large group of humans broke into a discussion, but after a few minutes, they all concluded that nobody was missing. Unfortunately, not everyone could fit in the room, so a lot waited outside. Victor switched to his Netherborne body floating above Necron and visually checked that everyone was inside Necron's borders and that some random child or undead hadn't wandered out of the town. From above the town, Victor could see the hundreds of undead goblins gathered in a cluster and a few humans that seemed to have skipped out on the announcement. Well, I hope they came and collected their green cards, otherwise they are going to have a terrible time in a minute. Sadly, Victor didn't have enough time or energy to deal with people who didn't listen to instructions. Feeling someone talking to his shadowy avatar, Victor switched back to Vox and heard Hyveth ask, "Ready to go? You control the entire dungeon, right? I need you to open a path through the dungeon's wall to the bottom floor." "Huh? Why?" Vox asked with his distorted voice. "You could teleport yourself around just fine." Hyveth scowled. "I can teleport myself to the edge of the multiverse if I so wished, but your demon core, as you call it, and the floating island you want me to put Necron on resides inside a pocket dimension. How can I access an alternate dimension and accurately place a town of people onto a moving island inside a void I have never seen before without guidance?" Alright, that was fair enough. Victor had just assumed when it came to spatial magic, Hyveth was unmatched and would get angry if he suggested anything. With a snap of his fingers for dramatic effect, Vox's teardrop eyes glowed with power. "Consider your request done. But be quick. If you can teleport through the gap, so can others." It felt like briefly lowering his shields just for an enemy to sneak in. But knowing his pocket dimension was so secure that even Hyveth would struggle to get inside was good. "It's already done," Hyveth replied with a sneer. Vox blinked in confusion but then realized what she was referring to. "We are already here?" "Yes. Now, where was that army you wanted me to teleport?" Hyveth replied with impatience dripping from every word. "Hold on." Vox needed to confirm whether Necron was where he wanted it to be. His shadowy avatar had no perception of mana change, and nobody else in the room had reacted all that differently. Switching to his demon core, he instantly confirmed that Necron had indeed arrived in Eden, a continent he had created inside his pocket dimension. Seeing such a tiny town as the only bastion of civilization on a floating continent in the void felt weird. The only other intelligent life form in this entire realm was genus Arcold, a golden chrome dragon residing on a floating island above Eden, near a volcanic region not far from Necron. The dragon awoke from his slumber and seemed to notice the sudden presence of humans. His wings spread out, and he leapt off his island and dived toward Necron. Victor didn't want Genus and Hyveth to interact again, so he switched to Vox and said, "My undead armies reside on the first floor. Teleport half to the border with the Mystic Lands and the other half to Eshnar's border. And you can control them from this far away." Hyveth asked skeptically. Clearly, she wasn't a fan of the idea that thousands of undead might be running around unsupervised. "I can control anything within the cursed forest. It is all under my domain." Vox replied, "Now go. Once you have completed that for me, you can go." "Very well," Hyveth said before vanishing right as Genus arrived in the town square outside Andrew's white stone palace. Chapter 79. Mini Dungeon. Victor sensed through the Black Ocean network that the massive blob of undead soldiers on the upper floor of the Grand Dungeon had vanished and reappeared in the far distance at the southern and western borders of the Cursed Forest. Hyveth teleported them further from the borders than I had hoped. Victor mused as he switched from his demon core back to his shadow form. He had decided to leave his Netherborne body on the surface with Alice as they would soon invade the Frostlands together. Although he couldn't give the body his full focus, he could make it move like a puppet with his mind, just like any other undead in the Black Ocean network. So with his Netherborne body heading toward the Frostlands in the north alongside Alice, he could spend a short afternoon focusing on Necron. Necron had become more than a simple side project he had invested time into out of absolute boredom. If he could create a utopia for the humans here and have them further their skills in more specialized fields, their cluster of expertise would be added to the ocean network hive mind over time. Currently, the undead under Victor's control were already impressive due to his skill being maxed out, or perhaps for the Netherborne race's natural affinity with the undead. Victor wasn't entirely sure, but that was beside the point. Despite his undead being so exceptional, they were lacking far behind humans with classes. He could tell his skeletons how to farm, and they could do it as farming was a more straightforward affair. Construction was another easy one, as his undead goblins had been capable of producing crappy houses when they were alive. But crafting, blacksmithing, heck, even reading and writing. These were all skills far out of reach of the undead for now. But, with the humans resurrected and added to the hive mind, their expertise was now shared with all the other undead. Soon he would have legions of highly intelligent and capable undead that were mass-producible, had the knowledge of everyone immediately upon creation, and could be deployed anywhere. All he needed was for Necron to prosper, and for him to add more humans to his undead network somehow. Hopefully, a few humans would be stupid enough to fight his undead armies for contribution points, and then he could add them and their knowledge to the network. If he was willing to invade all the kingdoms and slaughter their people, Necron wouldn't be necessary. But what was the point if he could achieve the same thing without needless slaughter? Victor could only hope not too many of the world's best delvers lost their lives needlessly to his armies before he could stop this demon lord nonsense. Having set his undead army on the warpath with a mystic realm in the south and Eshnar in the west, Victor returned his attention to Necron. Then, leaving the throne room in his shadow persona Vox, he stepped into the bustling town square outside Andrew's white stone palace. He looked to the skies and saw a familiar golden chrome dragon shroud the square in a looming shadow by blocking out the artificial sunlight with his magnificent wings. Everyone in the town square shot Vox questioning glances as he left the doorway of Andrew's palace. But after seeing his lack of panic about the incoming dragon, they all relaxed and began chatting with one another with childlike excitement. Victor could hardly blame them. He was sure it was the first time many of them had even seen a dragon. He overheard a few children scolding their parents for telling them dragons were just bedtime myths. The people scrambled out of the way to give the titanic dragon space. Genus almost didn't fit in the town square, and his mighty tail had to snake down a nearby street. His piercing liquid golden eyes, the result of the royal card he had soul-bound, was swept across the people present. Everyone went pin-drop silent. Vox decided to use this opportunity to grab everyone's attention and explain Genus's role in Necron and what would be happening while he still had a spare moment to spend on Necron. He was no fool and knew a war on 4 fronts was about to begin and would need his undivided attention, but his armies hadn't even reached the borders yet, so there was nothing else for him to do other than sort out his affairs here. Citizens of Necron, Vox shouted as his shadowy body rose into the sky and paused mid-air beside Genus's head that lorded over all the people present. This is Genus Cold, a noble dragon that once lived on the Grand Dungeon's upper floors. After being cast away from what the dragons call the lower lands and having a run-in with me, we quickly became acquaintances. I trust Genus to run Necron in my absence, and a few may notice his golden eyes. Vox nodded to Genus, and the intelligent dragon understood his intentions. Genus rotated his paw, keeping it low for the short humans to still have a good view, and materialized a golden card between his claws. There was a wave of oohs and ahs as the people of Necron got their first look at the royal card. I have granted Genus Cold the royal card, the highest tier of nobility. Those with similar liquid golden eyes to his are also of a similar rank. Vox raised his arms. Genus here will watch over you and sort out the more difficult issues that are likely to be raised, but for most problems, I would advise you continue to seek out Andrew, who will remain as mayor of Necron. The gray slime that snaked for over 10 meters had half of his body exposed out of the White Palace. He waved his stubby arm at the crowd, and a few returned nods or waves. As previously explained, those of you who wish to work jobs can seek out Andrew and be assigned to whatever you please. Vox floated back down to the floor and waved as he received applause and cheers. In truth, he knew his idea of running a town was flawed if it was scaled up, but for now, with only a few hundred citizens, having Andrew manage everything should be manageable. Vox could only hope that in the future, his undead became capable enough for administration tasks, and then he could leave them to take over from Andrew. Vox focused on his Black Ocean network and located the clump of undead goblins teleported down to his pocket dimension at the bottom of the Grand Dungeon alongside Necron and all its residents. These goblins had little use in combat, so he planned to have them manage the fields and other menial tasks around Necron, such as construction, with some human guidance. In all honesty, Victor was sure he could materialize food with just raw mana and even tie that ability to an artifact the citizens could use, like a glorified online shopping app, but he wanted his citizens to start trusting his undead more. If they entrusted their food production to his undead and saw them toiling away in the fields to harvest food for them, their perception of his undead would improve drastically. Swapping to his demon core, Victor looked over Necron and felt satisfied with its placement. All the land surrounding Necron contained lush farmland dense in mana. The time between planting a crop and it growing would be hours, maybe even days. And with him able to control the weather, there was no way for crops to be destroyed or fail to grow. A stream of mana-filled water flowed around Necron now. So that satisfied basic food and water for his citizens, a far better situation than what they were facing back on the surface when the merchants stopped coming due to the Demon Lord's announcement. All Necron needed now was some native animals that roamed and maybe some more dangerous ones further out, so the delvers living in Necron wouldn't get bored. I may even set up a mini-dungeon nearby infested with monsters that provide abundant EXP and succulent meat or excellent materials. Victor had already concluded that producing things out of raw mana was terribly mana inefficient, but dungeons were designed to spawn monsters, animals, and even terrain. So it was far better if he provided the desired materials within one of these forms, like meat from a cow or iron ore within a mountain, rather than creating iron ingots out of raw mana. And it also gave his citizens something to do and would fuel a mini-economy. It sounded like a good idea, so he got to work making it. First, he made the new mini-dungeon stand out by creating a sky-high obsidian obelisk. This would serve as the entrance. Victor then began carving out floors and populating them with monsters. But then he ran into a problem. What type of monsters should he use? Should the dungeon have a theme? He could create multiple dungeons, each with a specialty if he wished. What would get people really excited? Victor wondered momentarily, and then a particular floor within the Grand Dungeon came to mind. The gem golems hadn't been that exciting to him as a void monster, but to the average human, seeing a golem encrusted with enough gems to set them for life would undoubtedly raise some hype.